Hello, this is the podcast from the international research platform SIMM, with reports and interviews from across the world on the role music can play in social and community programs. I am Lucas Perron. This episode of the SIMM-podcast is a reflective one. We want to focus on Hartmut Rosa's book, Resonance, a Sociology of Our Relationship to the World. Hartmut Rosa is for sure one of the leading voices in contemporary social theory these days. He's professor of sociology and social theory at the Friedrich-Schiller-Universität, Jena, and director of the Max Weber Center for Advanced Cultural and Social Studies in Erfurt, in Germany. Following his now classical book on social acceleration, Hartmut Rosa invites us in his book Resonance to discover and consider the alternative relationship of being in resonance with the world. It was first published in German in 2016 and later translated in different languages. The French translation appeared in 2018 and the English version was released in 2019. Hartmut Rosa will be the keynote speaker of this year's 7th International Symposium, which will be organized from 12th to 14th December at the London-based Guildhall School of Music and Drama, in collaboration with the Copenhagen Rhythmic Music Conservatory and the research network SIMM. Before hearing our main guest of this episode, let us first listen to some of the musicians I interviewed about what being in resonance means for them as musicians and as practitioners or researchers in social and community music programs. Tom Powells, Chrissy Dimitriou and Mike Schmidt are members of the Brussels-based contemporary music ensemble Ictus, and guitarist Philippe Verneert is doing research on participatory music projects. Guitarist Tom Powells is one of the artistic directors of the ensemble Ictus.
To be in resonance, me being a musician, it's my daily job. I think my part of my daily practice to be in resonance in a studio with my colleagues, musicians in the first place. It's actually a practice that is where a lot of things are unsaid. I think when it comes to tuning, there's
to get
into tune with each other. It's very factual sometimes to be find the right pitch, the right temperament.
Factual? What do you mean with
factual? Well, something you can demonstrate. We tune. Before last night I played in 415 hertz with a gamba player. So there is in another type of baroque tuning. For me, that's a practice. Before you even start playing, you tune your instrument accordingly. You tune specific chords, and then while playing, once you've tuned, while playing, there's a lot of million micro movements that continue to tune. So while this first stage of tuning is just a preliminary stage, something that has to happen before the actual act of playing, but while playing, tuning continues.
Yes,
every
you can be while playing out of tune.
Yes, exactly. If you don't listen where certain note belongs to in the chord, if you're not sensitive for that, you are out of tune. You sometimes bend a little higher to have a perfect third in the chord. So it's a constant, and that the score is not said. These things are unsaid, but are understood. It's often through the communication, oral communication, and sometimes visual communication. This is often something we negotiate. It's a negotiation, this act of being in resonance with.
And is there, can you say that there's also a form of being in resonance with the audience?
Yeah, I would say that's before, after you've have this consensus about tuning, about rhythm, groove, too often something, it's for me as well a tuning to be in the same pulsation, find a common beat, groove. I think that's drive. It's probably the best. A second step is, I think, developing an awareness where you are in space, because the sound, how you project sound in space, depending on the type of space, you adapt your playing. It's as simple as that. Yeah, it's a matter of volume, a matter of sound color, a matter of directionality in the space when you're playing with acoustic instrument, positioning of microphones, negotiating with a sound engineer. I would say that's my second, and then there's the audience, of course, and that's that then is like being aware of how of the attentiveness in the audience, what you are constructing, and that's more often on a rhetorical level. I think, that's where awareness. I would say that. Regular audience is, I think, sensitive for tuning, of course, but reacts more to rhetorical, to how you deliver the music, the pauses you make, the dynamic you develop.
And that can be different according to which audience.
Yes, of course. Yes, much. It's something you sense as a musician. You try to always to be a bit on the other side. I think good musicians, that's what they learned while playing, being on the side, on the stage, but at the same time have an ear to be with the audience, and try to imagine how the sound is projected in the space and be next to the audience, with the audience, listening to yourself.
Flutist Chrissy Dimitriou is finalizing a PhD on the place and impact of the gaze in the making and receiving of music, and she sees concrete links to the work of Hartmut Rosa on the act and positioning of being in resonance.
I would say that in that sense, the idea of being in resonance with colleagues, with the audience, when it's my turn to be on stage and play, I have to say that I feel it more in the sense of searching really inside. I don't know if it has to do also with my necessity to have eyes closed very often when I play, but this idea of searching for the right availability to what is going on, which it really has to be very contained in me in order to resonate and appeal to the outside. I have to say that there, when I find myself playing and performing, the work towards trying to achieve a resonance of what I do with the others, I personally experience it as a very, very internal and inner mechanism that I need to do. It's like trying to meet everyone on the inside.
Mark Schmidt is flutist with the Ictus Ensemble, but he's also facilitator of participatory music making, developing projects with diversely composed groups around breathing.
Resonance or being in resonance could be, first of all, looked at from various different angles. The etymological meaning of resonance comes from resonare, so resound, and that's, of course, an acoustic phenomenon. My voice or a sound I produce is projected into space and rebounded. And it's actually a very interesting phenomenon, because without this resonance or this communication with my environment, with the space I'm in, first of all, my body will undergo a complex procedure to localize myself, to be able to judge how big the space is, because my two ears don't listen in the same way. And that will help me define myself. Without the resonance from our environment, we would be probably locked into ourselves. It's absolutely necessary. If we imagine, for example, entering an anechoic chamber.
Like at IRCAM in Paris.
At IRCAM, in various places, where there's absolutely no resonance. If I clap my hands, my clap will drop dead. If I speak, I will have the feeling I'm locked in. So, and I'm really dependent. My personal being and the definition of it depends on the feedback I get from the outside. And of course, there are various other ways to look at resonance, because initially it's an acoustic thing, but it could also be visual, it could be sensual, it could be emotional. And in my project Breathcore, I encountered this thought very strongly. So the idea is to collect a number of people breathing together. And I had difficulty with the fact of imposing a score or a procedure onto people, because breathing is something so vital, so extremely individual and personal, that for me it was not an option to tell people how to breathe. Mm-hmm. It's really kind of a last resort of individual freedom. So that was not an option, but of course I was interested in finding a collective momentum, a collective resonance, or how collective could keep the privilege of being a number of individuals and at the same time work together without compromise. And in the beginning I was struggling a lot. How do you do this? And I realized after a while that it's actually our ears which enable us, or maybe the ears and the senses, which could potentially enable us to become resonant beings. So, of course, we know architecture, a space will have a certain resonance, but the question, and an important question, interesting question for me is it also possible that I modify myself to become a resonant being? And like I said, resonance for me, for me doesn't mean that, for example, that I have to agree on everything. It's actually more that I listen and I am able to rebound what I listen to, and I don't maybe interfere in a political manner that I immediately block it with my first prejudice or the immediate reaction I have without actually listening.
So being in resonance, you could summarize it then with being open enough to hear what's going on and to hear and see what's going on around you?
That's one thing. And the second thing, I think, well, we have two approaches. One is the approach of the musician. That's, in a way, the pre-acceleration moment. So imagining a sound, listening to the sound
before you produce it.
Before you produce it. And the second is, of course, the inhibition of kind of an automatic reaction, as the reflexes we acquire over our lifetime, to just postpone the reaction a little bit, to give yourself a little bit more time to let the stimulus reflect and resonate within you, and then of course react.
Guitarist Philippe Verneert is one of the facilitators of SIMM research seminars, the one we organized in 2021 in Royaumont and the one in September 2022 in London. He did research on the participatory music work of the Ostend Street Orchestra.
To resonate, for me as a guitarist, is a term that we know very well, because you have resonator guitars, and also if you play electric guitar, the resonance, we call it sometimes feedback. It's when a tone is amplified by the amplification, and it gets bigger and bigger, longer and longer. It keeps on sounding, but it's the same tone. As a researcher, for me, resonance doesn't mean the amplification of a same tone, but it means a shared meaning between people. And so in that way, it made me think about the theory of Emmanuel Levinas, the meeting of two people, and also the theory of participatory sense making, where the interaction, where people meet in an interaction and they make sense of an interaction. This sense is in fact resonating. For me, it's like a definition of resonating, a new shared meaning.
Welcome, Hartmut Rosa. You're the main guest in this episode, but I've interviewed a series of musicians, some of them who work in social work, and this is what this podcast is about, really. So it's a podcast of an organization of researchers, scholars, doing research on the role that music can play in social work, in community work. And the practice is developing rapidly in many different countries. And so what we, with this network of researchers, SIMM, Social Impact of Music Making, we are helping to develop the research in this field. And different types of research in the fields of human sciences, sociology, anthropology, musicology, psychology, with a focus on the music practice in social and community work. We have yearly large conferences. We had one in Belgium, we had one in Paris, in Bogota, in Colombia, in Portugal. This year it will be in London and in December. We also organize seminars in which we bring together a small group of people during a longer period of 4 days, up to 20 scholars who exchanged their research experiences in this field, their methodology, and we also just came out with a publication. So that's in a few words what SIMM is about. And when I read your book on residence, it strikes enormously as something that concerns this field, because SIMM practice, social music practice, is all about doing your best to be in resonance with worlds that are not necessarily yours. Musicians need to do work in this field. They need to have this talent of being able to open themselves up to realities that they don't necessarily know in advance. And not only musical realities, but also the people they work with come from very different worlds. And so the practice and then the research in this field is very much about a series of aspects that you treat in your book without necessarily always talking about music. You mention it sometimes, but so in fact, I must admit that beyond this interview, I also hope to interest you to be with us in London in December, because I think that you would be an ideal keynote speaker in this conference, because the reflections that you propose, the thoughts that you propose on what this position towards our world can mean is something that is, without exaggeration, I would say, is central to this field of practice and research on the practice.
Actually, I was recently at 2 conferences which were both connected to music, and they were both amazing, really. It was very broadly on the phenomenon of listening, on what do we do when we listen. And there I realized that there is a differentiation in language in English, which you cannot do in German, right? Between listening and hearing, right? We only have one word for this, right? And I found it very interesting that you could somehow say hearing is a kind of passive. Of course, it's not completely passive, but it has this passive element. I hear something, that means a sound is coming to my ears, basically, right? So something is affecting me. That is hearing, I would say. It's like you have one direction. Something is coming at me and I hear it. And listening seems to be a kind of activity in the opposing direction, moving outward. I listen to it. It's almost a kind of physical activity, right? You somehow try to get in place, to move towards what's coming at you. It's it's the more active thing. I think listening is more active and hearing has a kind of passive mode. And we reflected on and discussed this interesting thing, which I tried to grasp theoretically in the last couple of papers I've given, of a state of mediopassivity, being in between an active state and a passive state. So I like that a lot. And the other conference was, it was actually by people responsible for schools of music, really higher schools of music, like the Mozarteum in Salzburg, for example. And they were asking about how can we turn such universities, in that case, or schools of music, into spaces of resonance themselves, right? What does it take to create a space of resonance focused on music? And that I found very interesting too.
There's more and more interest in higher education, in conservatories of music, to open up this work and this teaching also. And it comes from musicians, in fact. More and more young musicians wish to also do a meaningful job towards people who in our society may be in less privileged positions. And so more and more conservatories are preparing such accompaniment and courses. But it's in a beginning stage, but it's coming from the musicians themselves, and especially young musicians, not only, but a lot of young musicians. And, well, we've had discussions about this with musicians and people doing research in this field. The question of how to prepare is not an easy one, but that, of course, you will understand, because it's not something that you can really learn. Well, it's typically something that you learn on the job or in the situation, to be able to open yourself up and to be present to what is coming up. And then, yes, like you just said, with the difference between listening and hearing, in listening you reach out, really. And so it's very much a question of understanding and of being conscious about the possibility to be in that position. Mike Schmidt, this a German flutist who is member of the Ictus Ensemble, who told me about this experience that he had in a performance of Anne-Therese Keersmaker, a dance performance, Rosa. He had to come on stage on his own. He comes on stage and he could only play when everybody was silent. Well, when they did the premiere, that was easy because people were like very keen on finding out what would be the show. But later on, in later performances, it could take a whole while before people would stop chatting. And then at a certain point, he came to the experience that instead of passively waiting and hearing indeed the absence of silence in the audience, he started to listen to what was said. And strangely enough, so difficult to explain, I guess, but strangely enough, that was how it stopped.
I have a little anecdote there with Rosa's En attendant, where I start the show with a long glissando piece. And I enter the stage and the hall light stays on, so I'm not announced. I also enter silently. Public's talking. I eventually stand at the edge of the stage. I'm asked to close my eyes and remain still until the audience is quiet. Now, in the beginning, at the premiere, it's absolutely no problem. Everybody's on their tiptoes and boop, it's silent. And after 50 or 60 shows, you might encounter some audiences on a Sunday afternoon which have other things on their mind than a flutist playing a long glissando. And so eventually I found myself sometimes with closed eyes and immobile at the edge of a stage, waiting and asking myself, how can I get them to be quiet?
And so this is, of course, a very maybe even weird form of being in resonance.
This is a very interesting phenomenon, but artists all over the world, and not just professional artists, I mean people who make music, right, they will always tell you that they get a sense of the audience, right, whether it is silent or not, right, you get a sense of who is there and the mood they're in, right, and what is coming back at you at the stage even, right. So I think this fine interplay between musicians and listeners, right, or between participants in a performance. I mean, there are participants on both sides, right? And resonance is it's a fine interplay. I mean, the last small book I've written was called Uncontrollability, because you can never completely control the flow of resonance or of information there, but you can always try to get in this disposition of listening and answering, right, or hearing and answering, maybe one should say, to start this interplay going. And I found this a very amazing experience, to say it was by listening that something changed in the audience. I mean, this is an experience, by the way, that people in psychology, I mean, psychologists and psychiatrists or psychotherapists tell very often. I mean, of course, they know this phenomenon very well. By listening to the other, right, they establish something like a connection that changes something. I mean, for me, resonance has always a transformative effect, right? And this transformation sometimes is kind of created by listening, and in that sense you could say by a passive activity. And to call it a passive activity already gives you a hint of this medio-passivity, being passive and active at the same time.
In certain forms of music, tuning can take a long time. Indian music, for example, the ragas which are chosen depend of the audience, which is in front of the... and that's why the tuning of the musicians in the ensemble, they take a lot of time. And it's related to the fact that they're doing their best to be in connection with who's there tonight at this concert. And then they also choose the different tuning, the most... adapted tuning for this audience. So that's another example.
Yeah, I think there you see that there is a difference, which is probably important, between a professional skill, which we understand as being able of always playing to the same top level, no matter what the circumstances are, right? Yes. That's an art in itself, but it's very different from this kind of resonant making of music, which is always already an answer or a reaction, which is always in responsiveness by the way, not just with the people who are there, but also with the weather, for example, right? Or of course with the architecture you're in, etc.
In social music projects, community music projects, this is even more important. The SIMM seminar that we organize in September in London at the Guildhall School will be about this. The focus will be which music is being proposed and how is it proposed, how is it co-created. Also, the groups are often very diversely composed. Most practitioners, they want to work with these realities, and so that means that they have the availability to be in touch with what comes up, what people who are in general not musicians, some may come up with what they would bring in terms of the sounds, the music, the instruments they want to play. And another example I came across was a very concrete example of a piece which is Crippled Symmetry of Morten Feldman. It's not one of his longest pieces, but it's an hour and a half long. And the specific about this piece is that the composer, Morten Feldman, wrote this piece in such a way that the musicians, they can't tell in advance what the other will be playing at which moment. So it's like a very specific exercise in listening, but also listening and imagining what may be coming, and then come into connection and react to this. And
one special piece, which is Morten Feldman's Crippled Symmetry. And this really, I think it's a turning point in my career. Well, it's written for trio, flute, percussion, piano, and precisely notated. But in the score, he notates it in a way that actually the voices take different ways. So sometimes maybe the flute repeats bar 1 20 times. It's not precise, and the percussion goes on for one line, and the piano has shorter bars, and everything's actually visually aligned, but in time, not at all. So after 3 pages, you have absolutely no idea what your colleagues are going to play. Now, how can you stay in resonance with this, with the unknown? And to play this piece well, you need to do this. And I found there's really a way to kind of open up, be it in terms of a potential sound imagination, or also allowing different things. Of course, the whole thing goes hand in hand with this real-time, super quick interpretation of interpreting what your colleague is doing, or colleagues are doing. Is it now a pointed 16th, or is it a 16th? Did he, she slow down or not? Are we changing the pulse? Well, ideally not, but potentially after or in 1.5 hours, it's a possibility. And
it's a long piece of 1.5 hours.
1.5, yeah. It's not one of the long pieces, but and there is really this. I guess we could call it a possibility space, a potential opening to allow resonance.
And I mean, for me, this is the most interesting part, really, also about making music. And as you said already, it's also in dance, right? I think normally when you have a kind of, I mean, of course, it depends on the setting, but even in jazz music, for example, or whenever there comes an element of improvisation, not just there, but there in particular, you very often have the situation that one instrument or one player gives the lead and the others need to pick it up and react to it. But and then it's a kind of constant shift between listening and answering. And because, right, I mean, at first I have to listen, but then I react, and so the other has to listen. But I think the most amazing moments, that's at least that's my claim, which I'd like to discuss with musicians, and I've tried already a few times. I think the most amazing point where everyone kind of feels now we are onto something special, right? It's the moment when you cannot tell whether you are listening or answering, whether you are leading or responding, right? It's exactly when it feels like the music is in the center, right? It's not me doing something or you doing something, but it's the music which somehow connects us and is kind of given the lead, right? So, and that's for me is what resonance really means. It's not just being a kind of simultaneous sequence of activity and passivity, but a simultaneity. We react to it, but at the same time, we are not just the passive victims, of course, of what is going on. We are also the actors, right? And that for me is the core of music. And I think it is not just true for music. It's the core of mutual interactions on many levels, right? Like we already said in psychotherapy, for example. But even in a good conversation, right? It's sometimes at the end, if you have a good dialogue, for example, right? At the end, you could not really say whether it was my idea or whether it was your idea because it was an idea emanating from our conversation, right?
Whether you adopted the idea that didn't come from you, but you thought it was coming from you, yes.
Yeah, exactly. And in the end, you don't even know. It sometimes happens to me that I'm not quite sure whether it was my idea or something I picked up or something I made out of something that was picked up. Yeah.
We can be in trouble with that.
Yeah, that's right.
I wanted to ask you also something about, you write in the book also about this, children, the facility and the capacity to be able to be open to what is out there, in there and out there, and to be in resonance with these realities is something that children know much better than we older ones. One really incredible example, well, there are a few, but one is that Emmanuelle Lisère, community musicians and musicologists from Canada, told me she's been working with babies, 6 months old babies, who can without any difficulty repeat a sequenza of Berio, and not only repeat it, so copy it and repeat it and sing what they hear, but also respond to it and react to it, and which is for us amazing, but for them most probably not so amazing. And another example is something that I experienced with the Ictus Ensemble, the Belgian Ictus Ensemble for contemporary music. We started, and it's still going on, little concerts for several hours, and they could also actively, in between the playing that they heard and the little concerts that they heard, they were also invited to actively do things, and we were always really amazed. And so it's another example of where I have questions about whether these are capacities that we're not losing by getting older.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly right. I mean, when you really, kids are amazing in this respect. I mean, it's my conviction also after studying the child psychology and the psychology of development, right? I mean, there is a long-standing discussion starting with the Greeks about what is the specific human capacity, right? And then the answers came up with our logos, our thinking, our reasoning, or our language capacity, or even our desire to want to have things, the possessive individualism. But I think that's all wrong, right? I mean, what a baby is really focused on is it's a desire and a need and a capacity for resonance, right? You really see it with small kids. I mean, George Herbert Mead is a psychologist who has developed this very, very well, that the baby somehow sooner or later realizes that in the eyes of the mother or the father or whoever is the significant others, right? It's a recognition of him or herself, and it's through this contact through the eyes that you get a sense of yourself, right? You realize that these eyes are addressing you, and that your reactions somehow create a reaction on the other side. And this means this fine interplay of resonances. Oh, these eyes are looking at me, they are addressing me, and I would almost call this, they are calling me, right? Even so, of course, it's a visual thing, right? It's through this sense that we become subjects. And therefore, what babies need most, I think even eating and drinking, of course, has this element of resonance, because they cry because they are hungry, right? This is kind of crying, and then there's something coming to them. So it's this interplay of reaching out and feeling touched, feeling held, feeling nourished by something coming back. So it's this capacity for resonance, which is our first capacity. And by the way, it's also our last capacity. When we are old and suffer from dementia, we're still sensible to touch. We are still responsive beings and open to resonance. And there's a very interesting phenomenon which a colleague of mine calls mobbing at the cradle, right? When you look at a small child, what you just mentioned, if there's, let's say, a 6-month-old or even younger, the baby really wants to get in touch with you, right? He uses or she uses the hands, the face by making grimaces, right? Faces and sounds, and adults almost, I think this is kind of wired into us, right? We try to respond to this by also using our hands and our face and our making sounds. And if you stop doing this, you just look at the baby, you don't threaten it, you don't do anything bad with it. The baby gets totally confused, right, and irritated, and loses his or her posture completely. It's amazing to see this. Not reacting to this call for resonance is leading to a momentary breakdown of the baby's psychological fabric. You know, the thing is, I think when you mentioned that we as grown-ups find it much harder to listen to music, I think it's really true. This openness to what is calling me is the child's basic disposition. And after years and years, right, we get used, and then we realize, oh, this is music I want to listen to, and this is music I don't like, right? And then you're already closed. It's really like taking in frontier, right? I mean, closing the door to what is coming at you. So this capacity to let yourself be called or touched, I think, is essential for us as human beings. And it's certainly essential in social work, right? I mean, to kind of recreating it. And I think the main problem really that we lose it is not just that we don't want to be touched by things we dislike or so, but it's our lack of belief in self-efficacy, that we are capable to respond to what is coming at us. And even if it's sound, right? I mean, people realize, oh, this is jazz, or oh, this is classical music, or this is spiritual music. I don't like this. And then there's also the feeling there's nothing I can do with it. I cannot react to it, right? So I believe it's a lack of self-efficacy very often, which makes us deaf to what's coming at us.
To be in resonance, to be well-tuned, well-connected to what is there, also means that you should be able to make abstraction of what you wish to be there.
Yeah.
I did my research in this field in Kinshasa in Congo, so very different reality from the Belgian European one. And over a period of 4 years, I studied 2 groups who became musicians. One former members of violent gangs who became percussionists in a traditional Congolese percussion band. And the other group were children living in the streets of Kinshasa. They had to flee their own family when they were very small, between 6 and 10, 12, because they were accused of being bewitched, the so-called witch children of Kinshasa. And they became musicians in the brass band, which brass bands are very popular in Kinshasa. And so I met them and followed them for a period of 4 years. I was there a lot. And at the end of that period, I saw a good friend of mine, a Congolese artist, and asked him to please explain something I could not understand well. As the person I am, and coming from the country I come from, the world I come from, the reality I come from, I cannot understand how people meet. It's so difficult. The poverty is extreme. The people, those who should take care of the population, the politicians, police, army, soldiers, you have to absolutely stay away from because they rob you or worse. And still, there's so much energy. I mean, energy also in the sense of positive energy, things going on, being made possible. And my friend, he looked at me and he started to laugh and he said, well, listen, after all these years, you really don't have a clue. I said, no, but he said it's simple. It's very simple. We're fatalists. I asked him, well, what do you mean fatalist? Well, yes, we get up in the morning. Well, we see this other life on TV, these soaps from South Africa and Brazil where people have their problems around their swimming pool. And it's like a different planet that's out there and we're out here. And it's not that we like this or that we agree with this or so, that we have to live. We are living in this place here within this reality. But we can't do much about it. We as individuals, we can't do that much about it. So we get up in the morning, we see what we have, who we are, which talents we have, with who we are, also very important. And we try to make more than the best out of it. It's a form of positive fatalism in the sense that very clever in many ways, not accepting, but to live in that present and to allow yourself to be there and to connect with what you have inside as capacities, also means the little money you may come by, and also with whom you are. And I imagine that this is also an important aspect of being able to be in tune with reality, is to also somehow, I wouldn't use the words accept it, but see it as it is. And especially if you can't do much about changing it.
Yeah. I mean, I totally, I'm fascinated, and I totally, I very well understand what you mean by this energy, right? That you say there seems to be kind of vibrant energy in the streets, right? In the atmosphere. I had a very similar experience in a favela in Rocinha, the biggest favela in Latin America, in Rio de Janeiro, and I thought, it's amazing. I mean, people are poor, right? But it's somehow there seems to be, as you say, a positive energy, right? Almost a joy of life, which you would never find in a deprived suburb of some northern European town, right? Or middle European town. And I was also reflecting on this. I'm not sure about a fatalism. I think I know what you mean, but I would say maybe I wouldn't call this fatalism.
It's not what we used the word for, but it's exactly. He uses fatalism in the sense that it's our fate, the word that comes enormously back in my research, in the transcriptions of my interviews in my research, is the word normal. C'est normal. It's normal. And so that meaning then this is our reality. Again, not necessarily liking it but embracing it. And
I think the point probably is this. I mean, as I also describe, I try to analyze life in, let's say, in Europe, right? It's very much what we do is all the time goal-directed and directed towards kind of collecting resources, increasing not just my economic wealth, but also my bodily fitness and health and attractivity and my knowledge and my social network and so on. So what we do all the time is kind of an instrumental goal goal-directed approach to the world. You see it in our to-do lists, right? Or you and me, we have enormously long to-do lists. I have to get this, be fast, I have to buy that, I have to answer him, I have to make the call, I have to do the podcast, right? So actually in such a state, you're closed to the call, which are emanating from your environment, right? We're all the time focused on some things, and the things we approach I actually call it in an aggressive mode. I need to get this done, I need to get this fixed, I need to get rid of that, and so on. And what you could call fatalism, or this other way of being in the world, is since you don't live in structures which allow you to go in this goal-directed sense about the world, right? You're open to the opportunities that are there, but also to the wonders, right? To the things that are calling you. You're in a mood that allows you to be called by whatever is there. And if such a kind of mindset is connecting with other like mindsets, it doesn't surprise me. I think it's not just a feeling of high energy. There is really something like Stephen Greenblatt calls it circulating social energy, right? And I think this is something we lose, and this might explain some of the anger and frustration we find in Europe or in Northern America.
It's also seeing the limits within which things are possible.
It's not always expecting or liking what you hear. For me, this is very important. Some people thought or said resonance is just when you are kind of in your comfort zone, you could say, right? It's when your habitus, your expectations, and clearly we have kind of expectations of hearing, of how we want it to sound and how the melody should go and so on, right? But I think resonance always requires or implies an element of transgression, of the non-expected, right? And sometimes this is not very comfortable, right? I think of in all forms of music, if you have pure harmony, pure consonance, it's most of the time people find it rather boring, right? It's certainly not resonant, right? Resonance is
the unexpected, which is an important element.
Yes, and it's exactly between consonance and dissonance, right? You somehow need both. Resonance is what connects what you like to the things that you find new or even irritating and overwhelming, and then there is a bridge between the two elements, and that's what resonance is made of.
Sound engineer and co-editor of this episode of the SIMM-podcast is musician Mariusz Radwanski. Please visit our website at simplatform.eu.